we'd seen a flurry of investment in 2019 into all, but couldn't see really very many investors actually investing in what needed to be built.
I have a feeling that this stigma conversation is going to be mute pretty shortly. We're almost there.
The potential for impact is so high. I often say to people about the difference. What we want to see is a revolution akin to what happened in cancer research over the last 20, 30 years, but it didn't really pan out like that. I'm a bit of a reluctant entrepreneur, but you need fairly deep pockets and some patience because you are going to hit unexpected roadblocks. If there's anyone listening that's doing cool stuff in AI in this field that they think could benefit our work, please do drop me a line.
Welcome to the Evolving Minds podcast by Pink Elephant. Insightful conversations with the entrepreneurs, executives, and changemakers shaping the future of psychedelic therapy and progressive mental health. Meet the minds, changing the business of healing.
Welcome to the Evolving Minds podcast. Today we're taking a closer look at the realities of bringing new therapies to market. Psychedelic medicines are gaining momentum and moving along the path to mainstream acceptance. Yet they still face unique challenges, from patient safety to dealing with compounds that are still illegal in most jurisdictions. Psychedelics demand a specialized approach. Joining us today is George McBride, co-founder of Clerkenwell Health, to discuss how organizations like his are helping to guide these promising therapies through the complex landscape of clinical trials and regulatory approvals. Stay tuned as we dive into what it takes to bring psychedelic medicine into the future of healthcare. Okay, we're here with George McBride, co-founder of Clerkenwell Health. Hey, George, nice to speak with you.
Likewise, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Today's conversation is going to be an interesting change of pace. Much of the talk around psychedelics is generally around the kind of big ticket, like big high headline news, FDA approvals, NASDAQ IPOs. But there's a lot of hard work behind the scenes to get these new therapies to the finish line. And you have a unique perspective into what it takes to actually get it done. So it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about all of that. Why don't we start with a brief introduction to Clerkenwell and your work?
Yeah, great. So me and my co-founders have been working together for a while before founding Clerkenwell Health. And we've been working in cannabis and psychedelic field. And then we'd seen a flurry of investment in 2019 into biotechs looking to develop psychedelics as medicines. And we're excited about this VC capital, but couldn't see really very many investors actually investing in what needed to be built to create the data and ultimately get these products approved. So what we wanted to do was build something that lifts all boats, that was going to be useful for the whole sector, and that would ultimately help build that data that could approve psychedelics. And in the process of doing that, explore how these compounds could actually be used in mainstream traditional clinic settings, which is quite the challenge. So we wanted to train therapists, build clinics, and build all of the infrastructure needed to create access to these research and development stage treatments, and ultimately, hopefully, help get them approved, or worst case scenario, at least get the data together and show that they weren't capable of being approved. So we set out building this, raised some money, and have been building this UK-based trial site network, which is the place where a lot of people in the UK who are getting access to legal psychedelics are getting them through the clinical trials that are being run by various different biotechs in the field.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there. I guess first one to be, how did you end up here? Why this field? I mean, your background comes from law and policy. How did we end up in psychedelics?
Yeah, it was an interesting journey. I think like your last guest, Ronan, I'm a recovering lawyer. So I started my career with high hopes about being a criminal barrister that was going to be fun. I was going to be in a courtroom wearing a wig and arguing about drugs cases. That was my plan. I'd gone out and shadowed my uncle, who was a district attorney in LA, and busted a meth lab when I was 15 on work experience. And it was pretty much the most exciting thing I'd done. And I was really excited about drugs and the law.
Wow.
But then kind of reality hit during university. My dad had a mental health crisis and ended up in psychiatric care. Parents sold their house, and I got a lot more money orientated because I realized I was going to have to pay my own way, which I was from 18. And I decided to pursue commercial law, which wasn't really where my interests lay, but the money was good. And I went into it trying to make a career out of it, and quickly realized that it wasn't really for me. So then I went and did other stuff, and it wasn't until I built a startup with some friends, polling the 2015 general election, that I realized I really liked building new companies. And then I decided after that I was going to try and be an investigative journalist, and went to Nicaragua, and then managed to completely mess up all of my recording equipment so that I actually didn't capture any of the audio on any of the stuff that I was doing. Realized investigative journalism was not for me. Was sat in Nicaragua looking at job boards in the UK, and I'd been following a lot of drug policy organizations, and the Beckley Foundation had put out an advert for a job. And Amanda Fielding was looking for someone with a legal education, with an interest in drug policy and working proficiency of Spanish. And I was just hanging around in Spanish school and wanting to get into the field and desperate to move away from my legal background as a barrister. So it was the perfect opportunity. And I called up Amanda, and she invited me for an interview. And it was an incredible time to move into the field, because she was just working to publicize the results of the LSD brain imaging study she'd helped fund at Imperial. And she was also working with the Jamaican government, helping them with their implementation of cannabis legalization, and also talking to all the early cannabis companies like Tilray and Canopy Growth. So I got to get involved in cannabis and psychedelics right as the renaissance was kind of taking off and commercial interest was picking up. So from there, I went and did a campaign to legalize medical cannabis in the UK with VoltFast, and that was successful. We were able to partially legalize access to medical cannabis here in the UK. Went out and built a consultancy business, which helped secure some of the first licenses for cultivation and importation, and advising M&A strategy for the big listed US Canadian firms. That was really exciting. And then we saw the money was starting to move into psychedelics, and the kind of Overton window was just opening to be able to build a venture in this space. And we'd been helping everybody else build their cannabis companies, and we were all desperate to actually build something for ourselves. And we also wanted to build something that wasn't just a hype business, and something that was actually going to explore how psychedelics could be integrated into mainstream healthcare. And so we went about building this, and that's how we started, really.
Okay, that's quite the interesting path from like Breaking Bad, but wearing a wig, to they still wear wigs
For special occasions. If it's a big criminal trial, you still wear a wig, or for sort of ceremonial events, you still wear a wig and gown. Day to day in my life as a commercial barrister, I wore a suit with no wig or gown, which was a shame. To be honest, I was mostly in it for the pomp and ceremony. I wanted
for the wig, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Shouting in courtrooms wearing a wig. That was what I was really keen on. But it didn't really pan out like that. I'm a bit of a reluctant entrepreneur. Unlike other people, I just kind of had to try and legalize these things that I wanted to work in order to be able to work in them. So building lobbying businesses and consultancy business, and now a scientific research business, have all just been part of trying to legalize the thing that I want a job in, really.
I like it. And thank you.
It's purely selfish motivations, so no need to thank.
Yeah. And so then, I mean, that's a great start to be able to work with the Fieldings. It's an interesting road. And as with many people in this space, there is a core personal story very often, and you had to deal with it a little bit with your family. There's often that kind of story there, and that's a common motivating factor for many people in the space, that we get to witness that there's a gap, not just in the commercial side of things, but there's a gap in need and in patient need and help for people. So I guess that was a personal motivation for you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I grew up in a family of drug users with myriad drug and substance abuse, mental health problems. And I was kind of aware of the complexities, and the time at which I was a teenager was kind of the peak of drug war enforcement, to the extent that we had a real drug war here in the UK. You know, arrests for cannabis were at all-time high around sort of 2001. So I was really interested in this. It was very personally relevant to me, my immediate family. But then drugs and mental health, you know, tend to touch most people in some way or another. Some families are obviously blighted with issues, and others remain relatively unscratched. But none of us are free from the reality of the impact of mental health problems and drug issues in society. You know, so this is a huge issue, and that's one of the exciting things about working in the field. The potential for impact is so high. I often say to people about the difference. When I had a serious shoulder injury, I went in for surgery, and the doctors told me there was a 99.8% success rate for the surgical intervention. And when I went to the doctor for the first time for my own mental health problems, they told me that there was a 35% chance of success for the treatment that they were offering me, which is 1 in 3, which is basically about the same odds that you have of not receiving treatment. About a third of a chance that you get better, about a third of a chance that you stay the same, and about a third of a chance that you get worse. So the difference in like medical options for people with physical issues versus mental health issues just couldn't be more pronounced.
Yeah, the space is in desperate need for innovation. I think that's what we're doing here. I guess that kind of brings us back to my opening comment, is that we often speak about the big headline issues, how effective this potentially is for mental health, how much potential there is for people, how much potential there is commercially, but these are still most often illegal compounds that bringing them to markets, navigating them through the regulatory bureaucracies is extremely difficult. Most people don't realize. And you are there on the ground having to shepherd these things from Schedule 1 illegal compounds to hopefully medical mainstream. And the amount of work behind the scenes is probably would be unbelievable to most. So I think that's a good segue into your actual work. So maybe tell us what what are you doing? Tell us about the work.
We've built now and are operating 2 clinical trial research centres in central London that run a range of different psychiatric and neurological research studies, primarily psychedelics, but we're also looking at all sorts of other compounds and other interventions that can potentially help with people's mental and brain health. We're now opening a 3rd centre, which is a first of its kind, which is a research centre embedded within an NHS hospital in Doncaster. So we're launching that on the 11th of September, which is really exciting for us because it's a public-private partnership. We, as I said earlier, are really interested in whether we can prove that these interventions can work in a real-world environment within existing treatment. So being able to operate within an NHS hospital is a really good way to try and show if this is actually going to be able to work. And what we've done is really pioneering. It's the first psychiatric research unit operated by a commercial organization within an NHS hospital.
Right.
So we're hoping that we can really speed up study startup times within the NHS, provide a lot of support to the NHS, be providing revenues to them through the lease that we have and the other service agreements that we have in place with them. And then obviously for our benefit, be able to access all of those patients that are already receiving their mental health care through that NHS trust. So this is a new template, and we want to go and roll these out at NHS hospitals around the country. And our ultimate objective over the next year is to have a trial site network of 5 sites across the UK, giving good geographic coverage so that we're able to find the patients who need these trials and the trials that need these patients wherever they may be in the UK, and give them access to these research and development stage interventions, whether they're psychedelics or whatever else. There's a lot of research coming through with GLP-1s and various other interventions as well that we want to be a part of. But the lion's share of what we're doing is the psychedelic research. So we've done research with a whole range of compounds from 5-MeO-DMT to LSD. So we had to be geared up for when people are going to come in and have a 10-minute experience or a 10-hour experience. And that is very challenging when you're trying to staff a place and make sure that you're providing the right environment for somebody, whether it's laid down for 10 minutes or in a room with a psychotherapist on LSD for 10 hours. It's challenging.
Yeah, I can imagine. Let's peg those logistical details because they're very interesting. This public-private partnership with the NHS is very interesting, and I guess it's another sign of mainstream acceptance and integration of this fields with like mainstream health agencies. So that's good news. Congratulations, and it's also good news, and each step like this kind of opens up doors for people in other jurisdictions. That's good stuff. Let's talk a little bit about, give me the 30-second elevator pitch about Clerkenwell's services. A CRO. Let's explain it for those who've never heard it before.
Okay, brilliant. So explaining it in quite layman's terms, because this industry is replete with jargon. You have the sponsor, the company that owns the drug that it's seeking to get marketing authorization for it so they can sell it. They have to build a package of data for a regulator so the regulator can assess whether that product can be approved. The biotechs and pharmaceutical companies who sponsor the research don't run the research themselves. They hire a clinical research organization who then in turn hire sites that actually deliver the research. What we are is a site network, but a modern site network that does some of what would usually be done by the clinical research organization, the CRO. So we not only handle 100% of the care of the patients within the trial, but we also do a lot of the communication with the regulators and handling of the regulatory affairs. So we have to work with the Home Office, which is our DEA, to ensure that we can handle and administer these drugs. We have to build vaults and secure freezers and put steel doors on all of our facilities. We also have to work with the MHRA, which is our FDA, and we have to help the design of the study. We have to help with the submission of it to get approval. We have to ensure that everything is ethical on behalf of our clients. But then the lion's share of what we do is finding the patients, supporting them, and guiding them through the clinical trial, ultimately to the point of being dosed with these compounds, and then the data that has been generated from that medical intervention being written up in a way that it can be submitted to the regulator and hopefully eventually support a submission to approve those drugs. So what we are in some ways is psychedelic research mercenaries. There are, commercial people who want to develop these drugs, and they will all come to us and we'll help them deliver their idea in the real world. Previously, a lot of this work was being done at universities, but they can't do it at scale that needs to be done to get these drugs approved. So it's a lot like the psychedelic research that was happening 10 years ago and longer, but on a larger scale and for commercial reasons.
So you are helping shepherd these, I guess, we hear about the big drug developers. The names we hear in the industry are generally the drug developers who've, secured a patent, who've started a clinical trial, and you are helping get them to the finish line, which is regulatory approval. And I guess the other aspect you mentioned before is besides helping biotech companies run their clinical trials, gather their data, apply for the necessary approvals, you're also increasing access to people who may want to partake in a clinical trial because legally access to psychedelic therapies are heavily restricted, mostly illegal. And people who are desperate for help in areas where it's really not accessible, clinical trials are an avenue for people to actually get care when they're not otherwise not able to.
Yeah, and we think that's really important. What we want to see is a revolution akin to what happened in cancer research over the last 20, 30 years. So most of us know someone close to us who's had a cancer diagnosis. And when you get that, is a whole network of supportive communities, options to go and have treatment within a research and development context, support networks, everything. Whereas when you're suffering with a mental health problem, the usual situation here in the UK and most developed Western countries is you can either have a talking therapy from a psychotherapist, or you can take some sort of drug like an antidepressant. Neither of them are wildly effective. They can be in certain instances, but they're not reliably effective for, more than half of the people who take them. So what we want to be able to be a part of is reshaping this so that people understand there are all sorts of different treatments that may be effective that are in research and development, and getting people access to those, which in turn should ensure that in the future there are more options for other people who struggle with the same thing. So we think it's a really good thing to do. We really want it to be at the heart of patient access to psychedelics in the UK. And we want that to be a continuing legacy. So as and when these drugs are approved, probably from 2027 onwards, what we'll have built will have already dosed thousands of people with psychedelics by that time. And we'll already have all the clinics, nurses, doctors, facilities in place. And then hopefully those drugs are approved and we can start moving into offering them to people outside of a clinical trial as well. So what we're doing is a very slow game in terms of helping get them approved and then ultimately making them commercializable once they are approved as well, because they're not easy treatments to deliver. And there's still a lot of question marks about whether it's going to be commercially viable to actually provide these treatments within mainstream healthcare.
Clerkenwell Health's future may be beyond just the CRO world or clinical trials. Since you'll have the facilities and the experience, you could help with treatments once they're legalized.
Exactly.
Evolution, and there's going to be a need for it. Yeah, the bottleneck's going to be in access once these things are legalized.
Yeah, definitely. And it's not an easy thing to do. It took us 2 years of raising money and building quality management systems and training staff and everything before we were able to dose our first patient. So these things can't just be turned on immediately, even with a comparatively straightforward intervention like esketamine, Johnson & Johnson's drug. That still took about 4 years before it really took off and became a drug that with quite wide accessibility. And there you're just talking about a comparatively straightforward intervention. These interventions are not straightforward. They require a huge range of different experts to be able to do them safely and legally within a clinic environment.
Yeah, I can imagine 4 years from now when MindMed's LSD is approved, where is that going to be delivered?
Yeah, well, hopefully at some of our sites. We were the first site in Europe to dose a patient in their phase 3 trial the other week. So we are already doing that at the moment. And if the phase 3 goes the way that MindMed wants it to, hopefully they could be looking at an approval. Yeah. And we would then be looking at whether they wanted to provide those treatments at our centers as and when that was a possibility.
Okay. I mean, that's interesting. Yes, you're right in the thick of it. All right, so maybe get a little bit into nuts and bolts. I mean, this podcast is geared a little bit towards the startup and founder audience. So maybe some insights into what it's like to work in I guess we'll call it a highly stigmatized industry. You are trying now to bridge these two worlds. You're speaking to mainstream, traditional regulators, brick and mortar sites, and NHS hospitals, and yet you're introducing this, what is still a pretty stigmatized industry. So, for future founders, for people who are interested in the space, What are some of the realities and barriers of trying to bridge these two worlds?
Yeah, I think firstly, the stigma is nowhere near the level that it is with cannabis, which sometimes surprises people. Um, Trying to deal with charities, establishment doctors, NHS with cannabis was next to impossible. There are very negative attitudes towards cannabis consumption in the UK among establishment. And there is a perception, rightly or wrongly, that cannabis fuels mental health problems more than it alleviates them. Whereas with psychedelics, among kind of upper echelons of society, there's actually a lot of acceptance with psychedelics. There's a huge amount of expectation that these can be really valuable interventions. And we've experienced a lot less friction engaging with quite conservative establishment organizations regarding psychedelics than we did with cannabis. So this has been easier. And I think that's good and bad. You know, psychedelics has already experienced a bit of a correction from inflated expectations. And we don't want everyone to think that this is a silver bullet. And a lot of people do go on about that. It's important. This could potentially be a lot better than the treatments that are on the market, but it's not the solution to all mental health problems or anything like that. So we have to kind of temper expectations in some instances because there is so much excitement about the promise of these treatments. But you are still dealing with stigma. This, like trying to work your way through compliance barriers and stuff. Just the word, just the fact that you're dealing with controlled drugs is a huge barrier. And I think professionalism is the main solution to that, because we've got a lot of pedigree in handling controlled drugs. We've been doing it for a long time now, and that provides reassurance, you know, long-term successful relationships with regulators. And I think where British companies have done that in the past, they have been hugely successful. So GW Pharmaceuticals, which sold to Jazz for about $8 billion, they'd done all of this cannabis research quietly, methodically, sensibly in the UK during the height of public concern around cannabis consumption and potency. And they managed through all of that to develop Epidiolex, which has become a blockbuster drug. So there is, you know, cases where even with really high levels of stigma, professional organizations have still been able to work with those drugs in very limited instances, but it has happened. So I think the thing that's been most useful for us is being able to demonstrate professionalism. And there is, you know, a fear among some Brits around the kind of more cowboy element in some parts of the US. And they don't want to see, you know, shamans opening up clinics in London with drugs that aren't being stored properly and that sort of thing. There is still stigma around that side of things. But when you can show a long history of having done this properly, then that does start to get easier. But there's no easy way to do that other than to continue with resilience and persistence working in this field for a number of years. It's hard to short circuit that.
Yeah, those are solid points. I mean, and the British complaining about American cowboy attitude. I think I've heard that before. Yeah, that's a good point. We often in this space, in all sectors of the industry, have some sort of burden of professionalism, because we are the kind of tip of the spear of trying to get these medicines legitimized in all the different ways. So you being one of the first to navigate these regulatory hurdles, it's important to lead with professionalism. Yeah, well done, and that's an important point to make. We have to, cross all our T's as we do this.
Yeah, and I think that's happening now across the board. You know, there are about 6 or 7 really well-established biotechs with very professional operations now. So people can do their due diligence on this field and, see things like the Otsuka and AbbVie transactions and understand that this is a legitimate research field. There's a high level of interest from some of the world's best universities. There's a high level of interest from some of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. And there are a lot of talented doctors, regulators, lawyers, scientists looking at this field with interest. So, yeah, I think the stigma, isn't going to go away in all fields. It's going to still be something that people have to deal with. But yeah, it's just remarkable how different it is from working with cannabis.
Yeah, I have a feeling that the stigma conversation is going to be mute pretty shortly. We're almost there. We're almost there. So, I mean, I had a question about insights into navigating European health authorities. You mentioned professionalism. Anything else about the realities of working through the system? And you have to deal with the UK and the European system, which is a bit disjointed. And anything to say about that?
Yeah, it's slow and painful and at times demotivating. There's no getting around that. You need, and we haven't always had, but you need fairly deep pockets and some patience, because you are going to hit unexpected roadblocks that destroy your forecasts, destroy your timelines and plans. And that is just the reality of working in this field, that I don't think, again, that I've seen anybody manage to avoid that. So just normal founder good sense. Don't spend money if you don't have to. Have a plan B. You can't build a business purely on the expectation of the rapid approval of these products. And we already seen a lot of businesses fail in the first wave of this, because there was such dramatically over expectation about how quickly this would happen and how quickly this would turn into a really commercially viable field. I'm quite heartened, though, that we seem to have been through a fairly awful few years for the market, for the people operating in this. And now it does seem to have changed recently. We've seen much better response in the market to positive data readouts. We've got various different developers with a few $100 million in cash in the bank. There is some real excitement about the field again, but it seems to be stable excitement rather than hubris like it probably was in 2021.
Yeah, that's well put. Stable excitement seems to be the stage we're in, and the aftermath of the eventual letdown. There was a mild bursting of the bubble, some pessimism after that, and now we seem to be clear of that with a more level-headed positivity.
I think it's a nice time if there are potential founders listening. It's a good time to get into the business, because there's still a few years, definitely in Europe at least, before this is really moving. And there's time to build a reputation and experience in the field and still see it as it's built. So it's a nice time to get involved, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, maybe the money would be a little bit harder to come by now, but the risk level is probably lower. If you're going to enter now, things are a bit more stabilized. If you've got a good product and you can find some funding, you're entering a bit more of a stable environment.
Yeah, definitely. And funding startups in Europe is still tough, pretty much in nearly every area. It's certainly tougher than raising money in the US, in my humble experience. Mm-hmm. Not that I've raised much money in the US, but I've got a lot of friends who have. Moving fast and breaking things is still comfortable territory in America.
Yeah,
Europe, less so.
That's the benefits of the cowboy mentality. Has some pros and cons.
Definitely.
Yeah. You're working with, you said you've worked with MindMed, a lot of major companies in the space and in the CNS space in general. As much as you can divulge, where is the investment coming from? Is it still with psychedelic biotech startups? Is big pharma coming in there? Where do you see the investment and the interest coming from mostly? Or is it changing?
It's just on the precipice of changing. We're at a really interesting moment. So there's always one kind of outlier that goes early. So Otsuka acquired one of our clients, Mindset Pharma, a couple of years back. And that was the first big, acquisition from traditional large pharmaceutical company. Then there was the AbbVie deal with Gilgamesh, and now there's rumors that that's going to, lead to a full-blown acquisition, potentially a billion plus valuation. So we are starting to get to that point where I think there is going to be more of those deals. And, big pharma is probably the most impenetrable of any large industry in terms of understanding what they're going to do next. That secrecy is the business. So it is very hard to say whether that's going to be J&J, Novartis, Bristol Squibb Myers, who it might be out of those large pharmaceutical organizations. But I would be shocked if we don't see more licensing deals, full-blown acquisitions as we move into this phase, because until recently, it was just really Lycos and Compass. And now we've got all of these new phase 3s from Cybin, Atai, GH, MindMed, all of this stuff coming up. Lots of the data are extremely positive. And that is they really large pharmaceutical companies are best once the lion's share of the risk has been hedged and it becomes a race of means and execution, because they're obviously the ones with the deepest pockets and the best experience for execution. So it would be bizarre if they don't come in soon and start partnering with these organizations, because it is very difficult for a small biotech, even the better funded ones we see, to do the whole process. So take it right through to approval and then commercialization. The step from approval to commercialization is a huge jump and requires just outrageous sums of money. So, and then it isn't really about taking a punt. It's about having the money and executing correctly. And that's what those companies will be best at, in my mind. So I think we are going to see a big shift. But at the moment, nearly all of the revenue coming to organizations like ours, which actually do this research, is still coming from those large, well-funded biotechs. And sadly, what was nice about the field a couple of years ago is there was a really long tail of about 100 plus smaller developers that were doing interesting things. Sadly, vast majority of those weren't able to survive challenging market for biotechs, and nearly all of those have gone under. And now we just have 10 or less well-funded biotechs and very few, but some really exciting early stage, smaller biotechs with more limited funds. I think we're going to see a resurrection of those smaller biotechs, not necessarily the same ones, but as we see deals like potentially this AbbVie deal and others start to transpire in the market, that will then spurn hopefully even some of the people listening to this to go and build their own biotechs, because there is an expectation that there is a lot more that can be done in terms of developing new compounds, new approaches to this. It's not just this first wave and then the job's done. There's quite likely going to be a whole new raft of biotechs that we see popping up once they start seeing M&A activity and top of the market.
Yeah, I believe once we get that final bit of confidence from the regulators, once we get that first big FDA approval, once we get that first big pharma acquisition, we may hopefully see another round of people willing to jump in and do some of that groundwork. Yeah, definitely. And in terms of pharma entering, it seems quite ripe. I'm not a pharmaceutical expert, but it seems that CNS development was the least invested in the past decades from big pharma, and so it seems like a ripe sector for them to get back into. And then maybe once one of them does, and we have Spravato showing a really good case study of, I believe they're the best performing portfolio in J&J's product in their portfolio recently. So yeah, we may see pharma getting into it, hopefully, which would spur things.
Yeah, I think we will. There are still some major challenges. There are some structural reasons that big pharma dropped CNS despite the size of the market opportunity. And there had to be some really big reasons to avoid such a large market opportunity. There's a big problem with the diagnoses in this field and with the subjective measurements of these conditions. So the sad reality is that a lot of the conditions that are spoken about, whether it's depression or generalized anxiety disorder or PTSD, these aren't very well characterized diseases, treatment areas. So, it's a bit like if you were doing research in vaccines, and instead of saying, right, well, we're looking at a vaccine for COVID-19, you said we want to develop a vaccine for coughs, colds, runny noses, sore chests. So what you get is a hugely heterogeneous population, and it's very hard to then isolate who's suffering from what, and whether this is a range of different issues that these people are suffering from. So there's something a lot more major that needs to change in psychiatric care, and that's the better articulation and definition of different diseases within the field. And that is much harder. That is something that's really exciting at the moment as well, because there are previously and currently, the way that you assess whether somebody is going into remission from one of these diseases is largely just questionnaires or subjective measurement endpoints of the endpoints. So that's suboptimal for a whole variety of factors. But we're now starting to see much more work on physical biomarkers, whether they're blood, urine, brain scans. And we're starting to see much better utilization of AI to interpret those signals. So I think we're going to start to see a lot better understanding and stratification of these diseases, which then means you can create much more effective treatments. And when that happens, there's going to be a huge boon in this field, because I'm pretty positive about the potential to radically improve how we identify specific issues and treat them as specific diseases rather than quite difficult areas like depression.
All very good points. And do you see other bottlenecks in terms of this industry going forward? What's getting in the way in the short term, do you find?
In the short term, it's still the main issue that we've been dealing with since day one. There aren't that very many people trained to do this research. So we've still got a huge issue with identifying and training appropriate people to be doing this research. And then we've still got this big issue as well, that it's very hard to find the people who would benefit from the research, because they don't know that the research is out there. So that one's relatively easily solved. You can do big marketing and publicity campaigns, and you can create awareness so that people can join these trials. And that's what we're doing already. And we're already finding and training the right people to run these centers. But it's a long process, and it's a human capital intensive area. And that's not really what most investors are looking for. But it's also pretty AI proof. I think no matter how good AI gets in the next few years, people aren't going to be very comfortable with AI assessing the safety of compounds without having done real research in real people. That's probably a very long way off. So we're quite confident, even though we're having to build a bricks and mortar business with, with a lot of salaries. We're comfortable doing that because it's a big part of getting this done properly. But it remains the biggest barrier at the moment. In the longer term, the bigger barrier is that the DSM-5 is getting better diagnostics and moving towards objective measurements of endpoints and away from subjective measurements of endpoints. That will be the next big barrier. But all of those things are moving rapidly in the right direction. So I remain full of confidence on all of those. We'll hit other obstacles. There might be big social pushback. There might be the same kind of moral panic there was in the 60s. If we start seeing all sorts of fruity cults popping up in Oregon and Washington and stuff, these drugs can be misused and have been in weird and wonderful ways that the 60s was full of anecdotes of. So whether we see that stigma and cultural pushback I'm unsure of at the moment, but it could happen.
Yeah, no, you're generally bullish.
Generally, yeah, bullish. It's a hard job and it takes a long time, but there are good people with the money to get this done, and it's happening now. We've got so many exciting phase 3s already started or due to start later this year and next year. It's by far the most active the psychedelic research field has ever been, despite there having been a lot of kind of negative chat about it over the last couple of years. We're seeing far more research being conducted now than there has ever been in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have 4 or 5 or 6 phase 3s either in process or about to begin. So yeah, it's a whole new level of legitimacy, and maybe good for business for you, because phase 3s have a higher number of patients. It's good for the CRO business. Are you seeing that as we enter phase 3?
Yeah, it's an exciting inflection point for us. Phase 2s are hard. You spend just as long setting them all up, and then you maybe recruit, maybe 60, 80 patients across 20 different centers. So you spend a year and a half getting ready for the study, and then maybe one site will do 5, 10 patients. So it's a huge amount of preparatory work for quite a small amount of clinical activity. Whereas the preparatory work for a phase 3 is the same. And then, that study might be, 1,000 people across 100 different centers. So you might be seeing 100 participants. So it's really remarkably different from doing the small phase 2s. We still love doing the phase 2s because it is exciting when you're still trying to figure everything out. But the phase 3s, from a commercial business perspective, are obviously a lot better.
I'm happy the conditions are improving for your books, hopefully. And maybe just to finish up, we mentioned AI. Do you see AI helping you in some way, perhaps in patient screening, in onboarding time? Are you looking at that?
Obviously, imagination is the only limitation of AI, as everyone likes to constantly say, but it's true. So pre-screening in terms of finding the people that might be right for the trial can definitely benefit from AI. And we're already playing around with some things internally. We haven't rolled them out yet, but we're already playing around with some stuff that could really widen access to these trials. But that's just the beginning. Then we have to do this huge amount of quality work to ensure that everything that we do at site is safe and ethical. It's incredibly labor intensive, and there are parts of that could definitely benefit from automation, not just in terms of saving money, but actually improving, because where you've got AI that can check for quality, it can do that in real time rather than having to send somebody to go and pore over files. So it means that you're getting faster feedback, which means you can potentially limit the possibility of safety events. So we should see improved safety, greater access, and then you've got the piece that I was talking about in terms of actually measuring how these treatments are working, and seeing some really mind-blowing stuff in AI in terms of its ability to interpret brain imaging data and utilize that to try and understand what's actually going on in people's brains while they're under the effect of these compounds or post, which could transform this even further so that you're able to be far more effective. So we should see safety, efficacy, and scale benefits from AI. We don't want to remove the human element at all. There's also the interesting fact that AI, done right, obviously can do some of what a therapist does, and they can do it at scale, which is amazing for reducing barriers to treatment. But we're not trying to remove people from this treatment at the moment anytime soon. So it's not really about cutting out human labor. It's more about actually improving the quality of the research and improving the quality of the intervention, which is the most exciting bit for me, and improving the scale and access. Because like I said, going out and finding patients, checking whether they're eligible is incredibly labor intensive. And if we can go out and find way more people who need these treatments and are eligible to receive them, that just from an access point of view, that's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that definitely seems the area that could help the most. Yeah, you must run into some real just time bottlenecks there in terms of patient. Yeah. All right, that's very interesting. This is a great conversation. Anything else you want to add before we wrap things up?
No, if there's anyone listening that's doing cool stuff in AI in this field that they think could benefit our work, please do drop me a line, george@clerkenwellhealth.com. We are very collegiate and we like partnering with people. So if you want to try something with us, just drop me a line.
That's pretty good. I'll throw that in the description and throw out a feeler. I only charge 10% commission, so
a fair fee.
All right, great talking to you. I'd like to check in again later on. We're going to be hitting some interesting stages in the near future, so we could check in and see where we're at in the near future.
Amazing. Well, look forward to speaking to you again, Jason. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it, and good luck with all your work.